Maurice of Nassau was born into chaos, but he would become one of the men who gave the Dutch Revolt structure, discipline, and the strength to survive. When his father Willem of Orange was assassinated in Delft in 1584, the rebellion did not suddenly become secure, it became even more fragile. Willem had been the political heart of the revolt. He was the man who had tried to hold together nobles, cities, provinces, Catholics, and Protestants in a common struggle against Spanish rule. With his death, the revolt lost its central figure, and many must have wondered if the entire cause would now collapse. Spain was still immensely powerful. It had money, trained armies, experienced commanders, and the prestige of a global empire. The Dutch rebels, by contrast, were divided, uncertain, and still fighting for survival. They had courage, yes, and they had conviction, but courage alone does not defeat an empire. So the question became clear. Who would carry the struggle forward now? The answer was not another version of Willem. It was his son, Maurice of Nassau, a very different man, shaped by a very different set of strengths. Maurice was born in 1567, the son of Willem of Orange and Anna of Saxony. From the beginning, his life was surrounded by tension. He was born into a Europe already torn by religious division, dynastic conflict, and political violence. The world around him was unstable, and unlike his father, he would grow up not as a diplomat first, but as a man of war. This is what makes Maurice so important. Willem had given the rebellion vision, legitimacy, and political direction. Maurice would give it military endurance. He was more reserved than his father, more disciplined, and far less inclined toward broad political compromise. Where Willem often acted as a bridge between competing groups, Maurice became known for focus, caution, and method. He was not the emotional symbol of the revolt. He was the man who made sure the revolt did not die. When Willem died, Maurice was still young, not yet the commanding figure history would remember. The Dutch Republic, in truth, was not yet a fully secure state. It was still an uncertain rebellion, surrounded by danger and vulnerable to defeat. The provinces needed leadership, and they needed it quickly. At this crucial moment, another figure also rose to prominence, Johan van Oldenbarnevelt. If Maurice would become the sword of the revolt, Oldenbarnevelt would become one of its most important political minds. He was a statesman, not a battlefield commander, a man of law, administration, and negotiation. In the years after Willem's death, the partnership between Maurice and Oldenbarnevelt became vital to the survival of the Dutch cause. The two men were different in temperament, but for a time they worked powerfully together. Oldenbarnevelt helped stabilize the political structure of the rebellion, while Maurice began to take shape as its military leader. This combination, political organization on one side and military reform on the other, would prove essential. In 1585, Maurice became stadtholder of Holland and Zeeland, and later gained authority in other provinces as well. He was still young, but youth did not mean weakness. In fact, Maurice brought something that the revolt desperately needed: precision. Until then, much of the war had been chaotic. Resistance often depended on desperation, sudden action, and local improvisation. But Maurice believed something more was needed. He studied warfare seriously. He examined classical military ideas, including Roman methods, and focused on turning the Dutch army into a disciplined, professional force. He emphasized training, drill, formation, coordination, and movement. These sound like technical matters, but they had enormous consequences. War in the late 16th century was not won by courage alone. It was won by the ability to move troops efficiently, to hold formation under pressure, to coordinate infantry and artillery, and to take fortified cities with planning rather than panic. Maurice understood this very clearly. Spain's armies were among the most feared in Europe. The Spanish Tercios had a reputation for discipline, resilience, and battlefield experience. They were not easy enemies to defeat. If the Dutch wanted to survive, they had to become something more than rebels. They had to become a serious military power. Under Maurice, that transformation began to happen. One of the most important aspects of the war was siege warfare. The conflict in the Low Countries was not just a matter of winning open battles. It was a struggle over towns, rivers, fortresses, supply lines, and strategic strongpoints. In such a landscape, control of fortified cities could determine the fate of entire regions. Maurice excelled in this environment. He approached war with patience and calculation. He understood that lasting success came not from reckless heroism, but from preparation, engineering, logistics, and discipline. This did not make his victories less dramatic. In fact, some became famous precisely because they combined careful planning with audacity. One of the best known examples came in 1590 with the capture of Breda. Dutch forces used a peat barge to smuggle soldiers into the city, concealed beneath the cargo. It sounds almost unbelievable, but it worked. The operation was clever, bold, and symbolically powerful. It showed that the Dutch could outthink as well as outfight their enemies, and Breda was only one success among many. Under Maurice's leadership, the Dutch gained important victories at places such as Zutphen, Deventer, Nijmegen, Steenwijk, and Groningen. Step by step, city by city, they pushed back against Spanish control. This is one of the most important things to understand about the Dutch Revolt. Independence was not achieved in one single moment of triumph. It was built slowly, over time, through repeated campaigns, strategic gains, and the steady hardening of a state that had once seemed close to collapse. In this sense, Maurice was not the father of the revolt, but he was the engineer of its survival. As military success grew, the Dutch state itself became more real. Institutions strengthened, trade expanded, and the rebel provinces increasingly looked less like a temporary alliance and more like a functioning republic. This was not simply the result of battle. It was the result of military success combined with political organization, and Maurice played a central role in that process. But Maurice was not only a commander. He was also a prince of the House of Orange, Nassau, and that meant his personal life mattered as well. Dynasties are never only about war. They are also about inheritance, continuity, marriage, and legitimacy. Here, Maurice's life took a very different shape from that of his father. Unlike Willem of Orange, Maurice never married. He had relationships, and he fathered several children outside marriage, but he had no legitimate heir. That was politically important, because a dynasty depends not only on victory in the present, but on continuity into the future. Maurice did have a personal life, and he was not without close attachments. His best known relationship was with Margaretha van Mechelen, with whom he had sons. But those sons were illegitimate, and that mattered enormously in a dynastic world. They could not simply inherit his full position, as if the question were straightforward. So even as Maurice strengthened the Dutch Republic on the battlefield, the future of the House of Orange remained uncertain. This creates one of the striking contrasts in his life. In war, Maurice brought order, structure, and control. In family succession, the future remained less secure. Still, Maurice did not stand alone within the wider family. The House of Orange, Nassau remained a large and politically significant network of relatives, alliances, and branches. Brothers, half-brothers, sisters, and extended noble connections all formed part of the world around him. And among these relatives, one man would eventually become especially important. That man was Frederick Henry. Frederick Henry was Maurice's younger half-brother, the son of Willem of Orange and Louise de Coligny. He belonged to the same great family, but he would become a very different kind of leader. Maurice was the soldier, hard-edged, disciplined, and severe. Frederick Henry would later prove more graceful, more courtly, and more politically polished. But before we get to him, we have to understand the darker side of Maurice's later years. Success did not bring harmony. In fact, it created new tensions. Maurice and Oldenbarnevelt had once formed a powerful partnership, but they were never truly the same kind of leader. Oldenbarnevelt believed in provincial rights, political negotiation, and pragmatic compromise. Maurice, as captain, general, and military hero, accumulated authority, prestige, and supporters of his own. Then religion sharpened the conflict further. The Dutch Republic was not only fighting Spain, it was also struggling internally over faith, authority, and the future shape of the state. A fierce theological dispute emerged between the Remonstrants and the Contra-Remonstrants, To modern ears, this may sound like a narrow religious debate, but it was much more than that. It was deeply connected to political power. It raised fundamental questions about who would guide the republic, how much authority provincial leaders should have, and how religious conflict should be managed within the state. Maurice eventually chose a side, and once he did, the balance of power shifted dramatically. The outcome was one of the darkest moments in early Dutch history. In 1619, Johan van Oldenbarnevelt was executed. This was not just the fall of a rival. It was the death of one of the key architects of Dutch independence. Condemned by the very state he had helped build, that fact should make us stop for a moment. Maurice had done enormous things for the survival of the Republic, but his story was not one of uncomplicated heroism. He helped save the state, but he also exposed its harshness, its internal divisions, and its capacity to turn violently against its own leaders. He was brilliant, disciplined, and effective, but he was not a gentle man, and his legacy carries both strength and controversy. Even so, it is impossible to deny how important he was. Without Maurice, the Dutch Revolt might not have survived its most dangerous years. Without Maurice, Spanish power in the Low Countries might have recovered. Without Maurice, the Republic might have remained little more than a hopeful idea. This is why Maurice matters so much in the story of the Netherlands. Willem of Orange gave the rebellion a political vision. Maurice gave it military endurance. Father and son were not alike. They did not inspire in the same way, and they did not rule in the same way. But together, across 2 generations, they helped shape the future of the Dutch Republic. By the time Maurice died in 1625, the Republic was no longer a desperate experiment. It had become a real political force, a functioning state, and an increasingly significant power in Europe. Yet his death immediately raised an important problem. Maurice left no legitimate son to succeed him. That meant the future of Orange leadership would not pass directly from father to son, but sideways within the family. And this is where the story turns toward the next chapter. The man who would carry the Orange line forward was Frederick Henry, Maurice's half-brother, another son of Willem of Orange, and a leader of a very different kind. Where Maurice had been severe, Frederick Henry would be more elegant. Where Maurice had embodied survival, Frederick Henry would come to represent expansion. Under him, the Dutch Republic would enter a new phase, not just holding on, but growing in power, confidence, and prestige. That, however, is the story of the next episode. Maurice of Nassau was the son who helped save the revolt. He was the commander who turned rebellion into strength, uncertainty into structure, and resistance into something far more durable. He did not found the Dutch struggle, but he made sure it endured. And because he did, the House of Orange and the Republic itself lived on long enough for the next Orange to rise. And that is the story of Maurice of Nassau, the son who stepped out of his father's shadow and became a legend in his own right, a military genius, a political survivor, a man who saved the Dutch Revolt but could never quite escape the contradictions of power. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss episode 3, because the story isn't over. Frederick Henry is about to take the stage, and under his leadership, the Dutch Republic will reach heights no one thought possible. I'll see you in the next one.